they have turned against the center. The center is the establishment.
Some people may say that the domestic politics of foreign nations is none of our concern. History, of course, has proven this isolationist view to be wrong. Be aware, don't interfere. With that in mind, our guest Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at Western University, and I will be discussing the dramatic results of the National Assembly election recently held in France. Now, France, of course, was one of the two founding countries which created and populated Canada. 22% of us speak French at home. We share a maritime border. I don't know if many people realize that, but between Newfoundland and Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, we're neighbors with France. The bones of our ancestors are buried in French soil. We fought 2 world wars on their territory. Those who think that what goes on in France has no influence on Canadian politics have neither a grasp of history nor of geopolitics. So Salim, with that background, trying to understand why we would talk about the French National Assembly election here as Canadians, I would ask you to please summarize the election before we get into the finer detail and the broader ramifications. Could you do that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I mean, first of all, it's a pleasure to be back again with you. I don't know, it was several weeks or months ago that we did a podcast together. So it's truly wonderful to see you and be back again. Yeah, very quickly, I mean, the French election result that came out on Sunday night, our time, or in early Monday morning, this yesterday, took most people outside of France who were following the election with great surprise, because the expectation was in the first round, which took place on June the 30th, Sunday, the party of Marine Le Pen, Rassemblement National or National Rally, was leading somewhere around about 34-35%. Going into the second round in the French election, if candidates or parties do not win outright 50 plus 1% of the votes or seats, then there is a runoff election. And the runoff election was last Sunday, July the 7th. And what the election result came out, the final election result came out, that Marine Le Pen's National Rally party that was being touted to win fell to a third place. And what in the French context is called the left-wing coalition emerged as the winner under Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And Macron, who was running third, Macron's party that was running third, emerged in the second place. But no party in a 577-seat parliament, the National Assembly, has won an outright majority. So everything is within quotation mark, chaos in terms of who will form the government, what sort of coalition that will be, going forward. Macron has kept in place the prime minister who tendered his resignation or who went out public saying that he would resign, Jacques Attali. Macron has kept him in position till the National Assembly can get together and work out some sort of a coalition. So it's all up in the air for the moment. But on the final point that I wanted to make, the French election is very important because, and then the French election was followed by, the first round was followed by the election in Britain, July 4th. Elections are expected across Europe. And France is, of course, a leading member of both the European Union and the G7 countries, that is the collective West, and a NATO member. So all of those things together make the French election extremely important, because where France is going to stand going forward is anybody's guess at the moment.
It certainly is the most important country, G7. I mean, we're all part of that group, so we have to understand what's going on there. Now, what happened in that National Assembly election struck me, there's two things that struck me as interesting from my point of view here in Canada. That is the use of the term far right to describe Marine Le Pen's National Rally and their policies. And of course, far right is a meaningless term. If you try to find out what that means, you're met with a lot of different kinds of definitions depending on where you're searching. I recently looked through Grok on X to find out that it means, amongst other things, being racist, xenophobic, nationalist. And that term was thrown about by the press after the first round, just like the confetti in the air. Far right, take the first place. And with that fear-mongering, the second election put them into third place. And I think it was a direct result of the fear-mongering, the irrational, incorrect fear-mongering of mostly the press and, of course, the other opposition parties. And I'll take that and bring it back home to talk about why the press cover Marine Le Pen in France, while here in Canada, the People's Party, which may be somewhat of a bit of a parallel in many policy decisions to the National Rally, get practically zero coverage by the mainstream media. So I don't know if that's too much to throw at you. Maybe you want to take one at a time. Far right and coverage by the media of National Rally and People's Party here in Canada. Which one would you like to take on first?
From my point of view, these are the labeling or branding that goes on by the establishment. The mainstream media is the establishment. It is the propaganda arm of the establishment. And that would take us to discuss who the establishment is, and why the mainstream media then defines it, as you say, fear-mongering. My point of view is, and has always been, I mean, you rightly pick up, as Canadians, you and I, we have been in the public square in various capacity. We participated way back, which is now would be in the faded memory of people of our generation. That is the Canadian Alliance, or the Reform Party, that was defined as the far right, and then to bracket it up, we participated in the PPC, People's Party of Canada. I mean, I was a candidate in 2019, and that too was labeled as far right and continues to be labeled as far right. So we can contend with these brandings for what it is worth, but I think our time is precious. My time is precious. I would say your time is precious. The issue by which we have to not only analyze these things in terms of the electoral results coming out of France or comes out of wherever, that we sit down to talk about, and in some ways provide the alternate perspective to the mainstream media, is to look at the policies and examine the policies, whether you are going to define, whoever it is, going to be defined as far right or far left, and what is the center. So the issue is, what was the driving force in the French election? I mean, in France, again, people outside of France have to first understand the French electoral process. We don't have a runoff election. We have first past the post-election, that is the British system. And Britain had an election on July 4th in which the voter turnout was less than the previous three elections, in which the Conservative Party of Britain had won the government position. And going into the July 4th election, the Labour Party came out winning the election with a massive seat majority, 410 plus seats in a 650 seat parliament. And yet the voter turnout was less than the previous re-election, with 9 million votes. Keir Starmer Labour Party won 410 plus seats, whereas Boris Johnson in the last election, Rishi Sunak was the prime minister without calling an election. So the last election in Britain that happened was with Boris Johnson. It was a COVID election in 2023 or 2022. And the voter turnout was 13 million. So with a difference of 4 million, and yet the British Labour Party gets a huge, massive, the largest majority in recent history. Whereas in the French election, it is not a proportional representation. That is the German assembly, the Bundestag. That is based, the German election, the Italian election, these are based on proportional representation, and what number of percentage of votes that a particular party gets will be allocated proportionally that number of seats in the parliament, in the Bundestag. In the French election, it is not proportional representation. It is a second round where a party has to win 50% plus, or candidates have to win 50% plus. In the second round, the party or the candidate that wins the largest number, even if it falls short of 50%. So it is the plurality vote. So there was the election called a snap election by President Macron, whose party was the governing party in the parliament. Macron had won the 2022 election, the presidential election. He ran against Marine Le Pen because Marine Le Pen came out of the first round having the second highest number of votes, which then led to the runoff election, and Macron won the runoff election in 2022. The snap election was called soon after the European parliamentary election that took place in the first week of July. And in that European election, to the European Parliament, the right, again, go by branding, the right came out making huge gains, including in the case of the French party, Marine Le Pen's party, that basically trounced Macron's party in the European election. And so that put a dent in the legitimacy of the Macron government, or at least that's how he perceived it. I mean, he could have not called an election. There was no basis for him to call an election, but he wanted to test his position within France. And he called a snap election, and he called that election for June 30th. And in that election, again, Marine Le Pen came out ahead with something like 35% of vote, but she had to run into a second round. And that second round, I mean, that was organized in the sense the parties came together or party opposed each other. Mind you, it's just 1 week. And within 1 week, the people took position, parties took position, and the left in France, the National Popular Front, NPF, and again led by Jean Mélenchon's party, which is France Unbowed. It is not neither left or right. It calls itself France Unbowed, France Insoumise. Garnered the substantial number of votes, and the party, the Left Front Coalition, came out ahead. So if you go into what is the policy issue, that within a week, the expected winner, according to the polls and according to the first round, the National Rally of Marine Le Pen, got trounced and beaten down to the third position. And the third position party, the National Popular Front, leaped forward and now is going to be either the kingmaker or the king.
I believe it's the New Popular Front, Salim, not the National Popular Front.
So Nouveau Populaire Front is the coalition of the left, within which is Mélenchon, who has become the voice of the Nouveau Populaire Front, is the party France Unbound, France Insoumise. And so, again, we have to look at what is the issue. Whether we are looking at the right or the left, France is a divided country, Canada is a divided country, America is a divided country. I mean that is what a multi-party system or a two-party system does. It divides the country. There's a cleavage around the parties. So France is very much a divided country. The question is what sort of division there is. There are multiple divisions. What sort of them these are? We have to look at them. And we have to look at why is France at this particular moment going into this election, and France is not an exception, it is all of the European countries are heavily divided, as the British election showed. What is the issue? Well, one is the French people, the population, and the same thing is in Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Britain, Spain, they have turned against what we might now call, between the left and the right, the center. The center is the establishment. They've turned against the center. They turned against Macron. They turned against the conservatives in Britain. They're turning against the conservative, the Christian Democrats in Germany with the rise of AfD, the alternate German party. And here, I mean, that is the conversation we had in terms of Canadian politics. The center in the collective West, in the G7 countries, including United States, the establishment party, is the globalist party. They are the World Economic Forum. They are the Davos crowd. This is the one world government party. They have a one sort of agenda that they have pulled together over the last decade. In fact, it goes even further back than the last decade. The whole issue of climate change, global warming, is one of the driving factors which has led to rising inflation everywhere. And in France, the issue of global warming, climate change, and the rising inflation that is following these policies led to the Yellow Vest campaign. If we have again forgotten that, we might want to bring it back. There was some sign of Yellow Vest campaign in Canada, in the Freedom Convoy movement, So this has been bubbling, and there has been public clashes. There has been riots in all the major cities. We have seen, cars being burned, storefronts being looted and destroyed, confrontation between the police and the public, joined to the globalist policy of climate change and the green energy, and cutting back on the agricultural production because of the issue of fossil fuel and so on, is also the politics of immigration. A huge factor. This is not something that began in this election. It goes all the way back to the time of Angela Merkel, 2012, 2013, the wars in the Middle East, and the push factor of the refugees, the migrants across the Middle East, across Northern Africa, headed into Europe. And Angela Merkel and the others opened up Europe, to that. They signed the Global Migration Compact. Canada went and signed it. We in the PPC, if you recall, we spoke out against it. So this is another factor that is, below the surface, is a huge factor, and that divides the population. So if one wants to talk about the immigration issue, which is a burning issue right across Europe, possibly in Canada, definitely in the United States, with the southern borders open, then the right or the far right that is being branded by the mainstream media, by the establishment, are the people on the right, whether they're conservative PPC in Canada. I don't think the conservative in Canada speaks about this. They're party of the establishment. It is a PPC that raised the issue. We raised the issue. In Europe, again, it is a party on the right, so to speak. The National Rally, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the AFD in Germany, and so on. There is no such voice in the British system. Only now Nigel Farage has won a few seats, So Nigel Farage has been one who has been talking mostly about the UKIP, and now it is called the Reform Party, that has been talking about immigration control, and so on and so forth. So that becomes then the politics of the right, and the branding, the fear, and so on. And the politics of the left is against that. The politics of the left is, people are here because any number of reasons one can go through in recent time, but the people are here historically. France is in this 21st century where we are right now, 2024. France is a much different country than it was when President de Gaulle, the founder of the Fifth Republic, became the president in 1958. So it's a vastly different country, and the same thing is with just about every country in the collective West. You see, so that is at play over here, and the center has held the position all along till this election in France, is by playing against the immigration issue, ethnic issue, nationalist issue in terms of far right branding, and then has played against the left on the basis of economic policies. So that then becomes the left-right division. But in this,
speaking of that economic aspect of the election, Salim, I just read today that the New Popular Front has come out and said that they want a 90% tax on all making 400,000 euros or more, a lowering of the retirement age from, I think it's 64 down to 60, and a rise in the minimum wage of 14%. All these measures, of course, historically have been devastating to the job market and to wealth creation. And could you speak to that? Like, is the West, particularly because France is a bellwether country, I mean, is the West suicidal to continue to employ economic policies which have been so destructive?
I would again contextualize it. I mean, the 90% tax rate, and whether that is going to simply a talking point in an election campaign, as opposed to when people sit down and engage in making policies. So yes, I mean, taxation is going to be there, and the question will be how much. I mean, in the Canadian population, capital gain tax, I mean, we are all hearing about it. I mean, the quote unquote, the middle class. I mean, the middle class has been being pressed down over the years. I mean, I don't know. People talk about the middle class that they have money. They're all basically working hard. Two family, a couple working hard just to basically maintain a certain standard of living. And one of the attributes of the middle class, whether we are talking in Canada or whether we are talking in France or any of the collective West, because we are all G7 countries, and the policies are more or less, interconnected. A middle class is, in that sense, definitionally, a family that owns their residence. They have a mortgage on the residence. They've either paid up the mortgage, and they own their residence, And here it is in Justin Trudeau, and maybe the same might happen with Jean-Luc Mélenchon and others. And then the so-called right that is against higher taxation, they will have to come up, where will be the revenue stream coming from? But here in Canada, Mr. Trudeau is saying that he's going to raise the capital gain tax on family homes, if they sell and so move on. We have seen the price of again, homes skyrocketing. And this is not only here in Canada, it's been in America, it's been in on all of the G7 countries. People cannot buy. Housing is a crisis, and the government is saying, again, they may be left wing or center party, that another way of getting money will be through taxing homeowners, if they sell and move on the basis of raising capital gain tax. So if you put it in the larger context of the last 25, 30 years, that is, we're going through, I just mentioned the Yellow Vest, for instance. We had the Freedom Convoy movement. The last French election was 2022. The Canadian election was 2021. Let's call them the COVID election, So the rising inflation in France, in Canada, wherever we turn and look about it, has been this globalist policy. So we need to talk about what is this climate change that has driven and is destroying a fossil-based industry, fossil fuel-based industry that has been the lifeblood of the world economy, It is neither capitalist nor socialist nor left or right. It is oxygen we need to breathe. We need the fossil fuel going, industry going. Where did this science come down of CO2 is a poison and is destroying the planet, and we have to shut it down, Well, this is a fabricated narrative of a science that was bought up by the oligarchs that manages the World Economic Forum.
Well, this speaks to what my original question to you was.
Your original question, these are all interrelated.
Yes, they're interrelated, Salim, if I could, by one word, and that is fear. I mentioned that they used the term far right to describe Marine Le Pen's National Rally out of fear. Of racism and xenophobia. They use the climate change out of fear. The sky is falling. We have a world weather emergency. And fear is what drives voters to vote against somebody. And it has been seen for Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. So you're just mentioning all of the different aspects of fear, even in the economy. Fear of getting old and not having enough money to support yourself. So, yes, it is a common technique of all politicians everywhere to pick up on fear and to use that as a leverage to buy people's votes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the question then is, and we're moving away from the French election, but let's deal with it. The thing is, fear, which is one of the major psychological issue that is involved in a democratic election going on and people talking, is just a term, fear. But different people or different segment of the population or different people with different ideology that is driving them have different fears. So yeah, I mean, if the people who are going to be talking about open borders, immigration, and how the country has been changing over time, that they can no longer relate to that country, whether they are in France or whether they're in Canada, then it is the fear of the foreigners, fear of the aliens, fear of, people coming in that we want to project that they are the cause of all our problem, And then there is the flip side of that fear, the fear of those who are seen physically or in terms of their background and origin or the values that they are attached to as foreigners to the native born who has a certain view of their history. Their fear is that they're going to be driven out, that they're vulnerable, they're going to be attacked, So they're also voting based on fear, and these people are also voting based on, and fear cancels each other out at this, So then we come back to what is that which is building the cohesiveness of a movement, of a party, because it's not an individual. I and you are not voting as being in the public square. We have to relate to the people. We have to build up a coalition. We have to bring people together. So they vote for the party, whether it was the New Popular Front, which is again a coalition, or they vote for National Rally, which is again a coalition, or they vote for the center, So we again have to look at it. I will shift this argument about fear, about economics, to again, what did the people attach themselves to at the moment? I mean, a swing took place in the election, which we cannot in Canada measure because we don't have election like that, within 7 days, right? National Rally with voting bloc, according to the polling data, was in the mid 30s, fell behind into going down to 20s. And the party that was in the 20s swung up and went into the 30s to become the leading party of the three. And I would say it is a conception of France. I would say, what were they relating to? There is a much more, and that is what makes France different to Canada, that there is a much more cohesive understanding of what is French in France. It's not a question of language because everybody speaks French. It is not a bicultural country. Canada is by definition, bilingual, bicultural country, though we now talk about it as multicultural. So in France, it is, France is French. France has a history. France has a sense of its pride, its glory. France is the leading member of the European Union. Without France, there would be no European Union. The modern France, the France that is de Gaulle's legacy, is a proud country, though it has seen very bad times and it has been on the floor. I mean, 2 world wars, and so on. But it has the sense of who it is and who's going to drive it. In the case of the National Rally, that is Jean-Marie Le Pen's France, it is more ethnocentric. For them, France is the France of their grandfathers, or the great-grandfathers. So Marie Le Pen party has a history behind it, right? And we might not have the time to go into history, but the history of the party is the history of Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is now an old man. He's almost 100 years old. He's the founder of the party. It is his politics that goes back to the period after Second World War. He was a soldier. He was in the French army. He was in Indochina. He came back from there after Dien Bien Phu. He was in Algeria. In that war, he came back from there. And his rallying call when he created the party National Front. In those days, it was called National Front. And he was elected member of the French Assembly. He served in the French Assembly for a pretty long time. And he was, in the 2002 presidential election, he came out for the second round. He won a place in the second round. So in the second round, he ran against Jacques Chirac, and he was beaten by Jacques Chirac very badly, but that gave him a national position because he was the candidate against the center, against the main party, that is the Gaullist party, Jacques Chirac, in the 2002 election. So this party is an ethnocentric party. It is a party that supports the idea and stands for the idea that France is white, France is European. And France has no place. The problems of France has to do with the sort of immigration France has gone through since the end of Second World War, more particularly in the 1950s. That is, France became more multi-ethnic, Instead of multicultural, we are talking about more multi-ethnic. France was, of course, an empire, just like Britain was an empire. And after Second World War, as the empire started falling apart, people from the empire came calling into France, from the French Empire, whether they were Vietnamese, whether they were, from Cambodia, Laos, and others. They came into France after the collapse of the French Empire in Indochina. And the last major conflict of France is Algeria. Algeria was not a colony. Algeria was metropolitan France. And Jean-Marie Le Pen had fought in Algeria, to keep Algeria France, and came back. But de Gaulle, and that's a very complex and very fascinating history, de Gaulle led and solved the problem in the sense that France could have uh, slid into a massive civil war, but de Gaulle solved the problem by agreeing to give independence to Algeria, and Algeria became independent. But the connection with Algeria could not be cut off so easily of over 150-year contact, and Algeria is not like for Britain, India in a distant continent. Algeria is just, a breath away, just south of the Mediterranean, and so on and so forth. So the National Party, his daughter, Marine Le Pen, and others, his children, they're all in politics. They are trying to get away from the stigma of the father and the place of the father. Jean-Marie Le Pen was also called a Holocaust denier. He was known as anti-Semite before France became more and more multi-ethnic, because the Jewish question or the Jewish problem is a European problem. It's not an Arab problem or a Middle Eastern problem. Though now we are talking about it in the terms of Middle East, Palestine. But the original problem, the Jewish problem, read Karl Marx, read any one of them, it is a European problem. And so there it is. France was one of the countries, one of the empires where this problem was confronted and dealt with in a massive way. I mean, the history goes all the way back to the French Revolution and beyond. So Jean-Marie Le Pen was branded as an anti-Semite, branded as a Holocaust denier, and ethnic anthropologist. So there it is. I have tried to deconstruct it. In French politics, Jean-Marie Le Pen and National Rally has been branded by the center as the far right, because it is ethnocentric. Okay, so in this election, and in the 2022 presidential election, because Marine Le Pen was the number 2 candidate, she came out into the second round against Macron. She has bent very much to change that image. And one of the instruments of changing that image is that she has extended and embraced Israel and supported Israel, and she has gone public with it. And in this particular election, the Israeli, the minister for the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, came out and gave support to Marine Le Pen, and that was broadcast across France. Okay, so her identification with what is happening in Palestine right now is a huge factor. And the question is how you read it, but it was a huge factor in the French election. The other thing is the Ukraine war. So we're moving away from economics, we're moving into the issue of France's identity. In terms of the Ukraine war, in the 2022 election, which happened after the war began, the proxy war began in February of 2022, Marine Le Pen tried to reach out to Putin and Russia and spoke against the war. Okay, but in this election, she was not doing that. In this election, she and her party was more or less, because she had won in the European Parliament, her party, in terms of French seats in the European Parliament, and had trounced Macron. And Macron has been in the forefront on the proxy war, as France, president of France, leader of NATO, and so on and so forth, and is behind Ukraine against Russia. And she didn't want to take that position, so she didn't take that position during this parliamentary election. So now we look at the new Popular Front, the new and what were their position, that they so rapidly came together and was able to challenge Marine Le Pen. Well, Jean-Luc Mélenchon has been consistently in this particular situation on both the Ukraine war and the issue in Middle East, Palestine, Israel, Arab-Israeli issue, a Gaullist. He is a Gaullist. Now, whether you want to call him a man of the left, a man of the right, or a man of the left particularly, that this is the far left, yeah, okay, in France, the branding is going on. But nobody's taking a Gaullist position. He is the Gaullist. He opposed the Ukraine war right from the go-get. You know, he has spoken out about saying that if he was the president of France, he would pardon Julian Assange, he would pardon Edward Snowden, in the sense that he would welcome them back into France and give them French citizenship. You know, that goes clearly. What he's doing is what Gaulle did. De Gaulle did. Though De Gaulle, France was an ally in the war against Germany, but France was beaten down. France came under occupation, Vichy France. And though Hitler never controlled France, Vichy France was, in a sense, an independent country under Marshal Pétain. De Gaulle raised the flag of free France, and that he stood up against Nazi Germany, and he rallied the patriots. In the French history, modern French history, 1789 to where we are, there are two towering figures in French history that models, the French man models themselves, French woman model themselves. Two towering figures. One is Napoleon Bonaparte. Right through the 19th century, the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte hung over France and still hangs over France. He is the great hero for France. The corporal who became the emperor and almost conquered all of Europe till he was beaten by the Russians, right? And the second man, who's a giant in French history, is de Gaulle. De Gaulle wrapped himself in the French flag. He stood for France, and he saved the honor of France, saved the glory of France, you know, by leading the Free French in the war, in the Second World War, liberating France, came back to France after D-Day, the invasion, 1944. And then, while he went away for a while, he was called back by the Fourth Republic to save France when France was disintegrating as a result of the Algerian War. And that's the history. And France has always stood up in the context of Napoleon and then in the context of de Gaulle as a powerful, proud country with its own glory and its own history, you know. And so though it is of the West, it is Europe, it doesn't take the Anglo-American view. First the British, of course, Napoleon fought the British, and then, you know, the French called the British Albion perfidy, and then with America following the British after the Second World War, becoming the empire, France doesn't go along with it. It was de Gaulle that took France out of NATO. It was de Gaulle that talked about a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, that is Russia. It was de Gaulle who reached out to Khrushchev. It was de Gaulle, and under his leadership, the Communist Party was the second largest party in France and the largest party in Europe. Okay, so these are the mind-shaping, character-shaping, self-understanding identity of who is French man and woman. All right. So, in contrast to the ethnocentric France of the Marie Le Pen and her national rally, she changed the name from her father, National Front, to create this new image that she can embrace others, and that began with her leaning towards Israel, accepting the Jews, and so on and so forth, and standing up now as a defender of Jews and against anti-Semitism. The binary opposition, I mean, that you and Bob and others want to talk about, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. He stands for support for Russia, against the war in Ukraine, and denounces the genocide that is going on, and has called for the immediate recognition of Palestinian state. Okay, so there's the two. France, as I said, is a far different country, you know, from when Jean-Marie Le Pen began his politics in 1950s. France is a complete. It is he, by the way, in 1998, after almost a century, when France basically gave the World Cup itself. I mean, that's France's contribution, that goal, World Cups. France is a soccer crazy country, just as most Europeans are. For 100 years, France had not been able to win the World Cup. And then in 1998, the last World Cup tournament of the 20th century, France wins the World Cup. The team is basically made up of New France. Most of the players are from Franco-Africa and Franco-Maghrebian. The man who led the team to win the World Cup was Zidane, an Algerian born in France, you know. And what does Jean-Marie Le Pen says? I don't recognize the French team. They cannot sing the national anthem properly. And that was being played out right now in the Euro Cup. The entire French team is a Franco-African, Franco-Maghrebian team, you know. The only white guy in the French team is the manager of the French team, who was a former player in the 1998 team. And here it is. You have the division of France, which is a multi-ethnic division, and the people in France, particularly in the main metropolitan centers in Paris, in Marseille, in Toulouse. If you look at the map of France on the election result, you can see Paris and all of South France or around the Mediterranean, the Côte d'Azur and so on, is all brown. That is where Jean-Luc Mélenchon and his coalition won the votes, you know. That is in the metropolitan centers, which is where the new immigrants are, you know. I mean, they were rallying, and I've been going to France pretty often, pretty regularly, because of my own connection through my wife. And I was following this. There is no more a Stalingrad in Russia. They changed the name, you know. But the main station in France, in the 19 arrondissement, the metro is called Stalingrad. The square is called Stalingrad. You know, I spent a lot of time over there. And it has these revolutionary names. You know, I lived in an apartment on Simon Bolivar Avenue, right? So there it was the rallying taking place. And the other rally that was taking place was in the 10th arrondissement, very close to the National Assembly, the Place de la République. So that is the Republic, you know, that's France, you know, and that's where the crowd was coming together, the crowd that was rallying around Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Now, Mr. Macron made, after losing the first round, he made a calculation to survive, that he announced. He didn't support Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and Mélenchon has no time for Macron, but Macron made the announcement immediately after the polls closed and the numbers came out on June 30th, July 1st, that in all the seats where the Marie Le Pen's party, the rally, the national rally, is leading, all the others should step out and let whoever has the highest number of votes in the going into the second round stand. So it made it strategic. He said to his people to go and make a strategic alliance. And so the people in the center shifted their vote to the New Popular Front.
There's a common refrain in politics that you get the government you deserve. So it's just a shame what you're describing for the New Popular Front. There are a number of their policies that I would agree with, and I think that you would agree with. And it's a shame that in order to get those policies, you have to accept the other policies, in this case, the economic policies, which are devastatingly bad for France, just to get the other policies, the more foreign policies about Ukraine, for example, which is a good thing, or maybe even not even voting to go into NATO, like de Gaulle. You know, those kinds of policies I would agree with. Don't agree with the economic policies. So it's a mixed bag. You have to take the whole package deal if you want to get one thing. And I think that same applies to Canadian politics. There's a lot of people who would vote for the Liberal government because of a single policy, perhaps his cozying up to the LGBTQ crowd, or vote Conservative for perhaps an economic reason, and yet you still get all of the baggage that is associated with each party. And it sounds as if this is exactly what's going on in France. You're getting these baggages associated with the things that you want to vote for. You get all of the stuff that is destructive. Your thoughts on that?
Was, in spring, in late spring, I was in France. And then in early summer, I traveled to Central Europe. I went to Prague and Czech Republic and Austria and so on. And it just so happened that when I was in France, France was going through railway strike. You know, it was all shut down. This was again the yellow version, but also in the main highways in France. And I was in basically Paris and the surrounding area. I traveled because I have friends and people. Had to take the Uber because the metro was shut down, the railways were shut down, and on the main highways, the French farmers had come and they were blocking. Okay, I go to Czech Republic. I go to Prague. I went with my wife and daughter. We were out for 2 weeks and we were traveling. The railways were running okay. There was all of that, but the agricultural workers, the farm workers, and the truckers were out in numbers. There were strikes in different places I saw. Roads were blocked, huge rallies taking place. Now, you know, and I know this is connected to the whole carbon tax business. This is connected to, you know, they're trying to cut down the flatulence of the cows, the methane gas, right? And it is driving the prices up, you know. It is really, and there's already a housing problem. There is a fuel problem, and everything is connected to that, you know. So massive inflation is taking place. The question is, who is pushing these policies? And my argument that these policies are being pushed by the center, by the establishment parties, who brought us the COVID, who has brought us this whole scam about the carbon, CO2, and all these related matters. And so, is this a left-right issue, or is this an issue that we have to destroy this policy? People have finally woken up. And then there is the war taking place, which is again a matter of skyrocketing inflation that is taking place as a result. Europe has become extremely expensive. I mean, the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 has having impact right across the board, you know, but the mainstream politicians are not speaking about it. I mean, just as you and I are talking today, this morning, the European leaders, irrespective of what the people are saying in the election, and whether it's left or right, immaterial, they're all gathered in Washington for the 75th anniversary of NATO to continue the war in Ukraine. And the warmongers who are pushing this war, including our prime minister, our opposition leader, that is the entire parliament, who was standing and saluting the Waffen SS in the parliament, and there was no voice that stood up and spoke against it. They're pushing this at the expense of what? At the expense of the Ukrainian. Over 500,000 Ukrainians are dead, right? The flower of Ukraine is dead. And over 1 million or more are crippled for life. And again, 10 million or more are refugees from their country. So what is the purpose of this war? And why is this war taking place? And then you have the global rearrangement taking place. And nobody in the West, that is the political leaders, are talking about this. So you have, in the French election, you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon comes out and talks about it. So that's why I'm saying he's the Gaullist. He's coming out and talking about it. On the right, that is, Marine Le Pen is still beating a policy which is losing its appeal to not only France, if it is a European policy, to France, which is a completely different France than the France of her father. And same thing in Germany, and same thing in Netherlands.
This
Same.
is interesting, Salim, because what you're suggesting, and a lot of this is new to me, what you're suggesting is that perhaps contrary to the silo that I have surrounding me on X, which has basically said this is a terrible result for France, this may be actually a good result for France if it keeps NATO out of Ukraine. Because if the New Popular Front is able to do that, that will be a fantastic thing for Canada and for the rest of the world. And they'll have to deal with their own domestic economic problems themselves. They don't really affect Canadians as much as going to war with nuclear Russia. So on the one hand, my silo is saying, oh, what a terrible thing. Marine Le Pen didn't get, elected to keep the Muslims out, more or less is what that issue is, even though 10% of France is Islam. On the other hand, now we may not go to war. Isn't that ironic?
Well, exactly, because my point of view is that brandings are basically not to have the in-depth analysis, and it to stoke the very word that you began with, fear, which in itself is an irrational thing. You fear what you don't know. So the more you know about it, the less you fear it, because you understand the situation, you understand the problem, and you got to deal with it. We are living in a very complex world, but the world has always been complex, but now it is even more so. The world of 19 of the this is the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO, which was formed in 1949. Next year, 2025, will be the 80th anniversary of the end of Second World War, right? So we're taking a span of 80 years, say a century, but almost a century. The world has profoundly changed in this century. Those who have the living memory can do the comparison. They can see and understand comparatively. Europe, that was on its knees at the end of Second World War, rose up by the 1970s, when de Gaulle was the president of France, and he died in 1970. That's what, 54 years ago. Europe had risen up. But Europe had risen up with the support not only of the Marshall Plan and the American investment and so on, but with the manpower needed to build a Europe that was in ruin after 1945, with the empire coming into Europe. Like it or not, that is what it was. The empire that came into Europe by the invitation of Europe. Nobody was gate crashing into Europe. So whether it was the Franco-Africans or the Algerians, you're talking about Muslims, or in Britain, people from India, the subcontinent, in Netherlands, people from Indonesia and Malaysia, which was part of the Dutch Empire. So the people who came, either looking for opportunities and jobs, or invited by giving them jobs that were plentiful in the rebuilding of Europe. And so their children and grandchildren are now French. They are no more from Indonesia or no more from India. I mean, take the case of Rishi Sunak, who became the prime minister of Britain. On a personal term, I have no time for him. On his political philosophy, I have no time for him. But I'm talking about him as the face of an Indian. His family, his father and his grandfather, They migrated from India, that was the crown jewel of the British Empire, to East Africa, that is Kenya. There was a lot of migration into Kenya, into Uganda, into South Africa under the British, because the British needed the workers. They were the rulers. They needed the workers in the middle, and then at the bottom were the Africans. All right. So when Kenya and Uganda and all were given independence by Britain, the Indians were unwanted by the blacks. And so the empire had to open its door, or opened his door, and Rishi Sunak's family went to England. And he's a product of the English society. Same as the guy who is the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, you know. The same story is being repeated in Germany, is being repeated in France. And one of the things, you know, I mean, we focus on politics, but politics, we focus on it as a game of who is winning and losing in terms of political power. But politics as an expression of the society at large, through the terms of literature, music, sports, you get a different picture. And if you bring all of those into play, then you see what is happening. I mean, Indians were taught cricket by the Englishmen. Cricket is not an Indian game, but cricket is now what Indians play fanatically. And the British test team are now pretty much dominated by people from the Indian subcontinent, whether they're Pakistanis or Indians, you know. Same thing with soccer. In the case of France, they're the guys who run with soccer. They're crazy about soccer.
It is a small world, Salim, and you and I often joke about the fact that you being born in Calcutta, you speak English. I'm from Newfoundland. I speak English. You were raised or taught by Jesuits. I was taught by Jesuits. It's a small world, and yet we still have these fears about each other because of picayune, stupid differences, while what we should be concentrating on is our ideas. You know, it's not the color of your skin, it's the color of your ideas that we should really be talking about. Bob Metz would say that. And I think that the collective nature of the left groups, everybody has to belong to a collective, a group, a union, a color, a race, a religion, a sex, a sexual orientation. It is us on the right, to get back to that left-right dichotomy or spectrum. No, it's a dichotomy. It's the right thinks only of the individual.
Yeah.
Only of the individual, does not care about your personal beliefs, your personal habits, your race, your collective. And so when we see the National Assembly election in France, I look at it, or I try to look at it, as you are, with the big picture, the view from 30,000 feet, of what does this mean for the individuals of France? What does it mean for the individuals here in Canada? And from my point of view, there's both a good and a bad outcome. The good outcome is the people of France got what they voted for, so they should be happy. You know, they're not going to be happy. Everybody is going to be disgruntled, as everybody is. You can't please all of the people all of the time. So let's get back to my silo and your silo. And
I don't want to be in a silo.
well, we're sort of in an echo chamber. You go on to X, we all follow the same people, more or less. You know, we all hear the same stories. If I talk to my friends, my neighbors, my relatives, they've never heard of some of the people that I mentioned that you know, that we've met. But yes, we live in a silo. But from that silo, do you consider the election in the National Assembly in France to be of a positive or a negative?
Well, I mean, as I have deconstructed in the time that we had, I see it is the France that is not reported, which basically came out the winner. That is not reported by the mainstream media. You know, I mean, look at it in the collective West. I mean, the issues that is now driving politics, and the elite in the West is not addressing it, but they are more and more obstinate in pushing it, is the war and peace issue. I mean, I talked about this with you when in February 2022, when the special military operation began and the proxy war began, that 2022 was the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. For heaven's sake, there was no reference to that in the mainstream media. And here, NATO, the collective West, the G7, was pushing a policy that led to an outbreak of military action, war in effect, with a nuclear power country, a nuclear giant. Whatever was the former Soviet Union that collapsed in 1991, it collapsed because of economic reasons. It collapsed because it could not function and deliver whatever was the utopia of socialism, right? And ultimately, Soviet Union could not manage the economic side. Gorbachev tried to do that with his perestroika, opening the Russian economy to, private enterprise and so on and so forth, which is what the Chinese have been doing for the last 30 years. And glasnost, opening up, the arena for more free discussion and free speech and so on and so forth. But it was too rotten, too decadent, too decayed, and Soviet Union collapsed, right? But that collapse didn't mean that the Soviet Union had become another Somalia or another Rwanda. Soviet Union, as Russia was and remains the most powerful nuclear armed country in the world. And here the collective West was pushing eastward, the NATO expansion, with total disregard for the Russian concern about their security need. All right, so that. And for the last 2 years, that's exactly what the collective West has been doing. Where is our leadership in Canada? The 80 years of this modern history that I'm demarcating from 1945 to now, that is the post-Second World War period, Canada's identity was shaped, constructed, reshaped, and projected by our leaders of the period, beginning with, Louis Saint Laurent, Mackenzie King, Louis Saint Laurent, John Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, into Pierre Trudeau Sr., that Canada is part of the West, but Canada is also a founding member of the United Nations. And Canada's position as a middle power, a small country, at that time the population was something around about 15 million people. Today the population is around 40 million people, right? Canada as the middle power, a small country with vast resources, will be an agent of change in the positive direction, with the memories of Second World War hanging over us, in a positive direction, to create a world where we will provide help and development to the newly emerging countries of Africa and Asia as the empires were dismantling. And so peacekeeping, peacemaking, the United Nations, in recent times, coming closer to our time, that is at the end of the Cold War, the contribution of Canada, both in money, in talents, in other ways and resources, through the UN in the making of the policy of responsibility to protect, in establishing what became the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute. We took a leading position, not a secondary position. We are signatories to that. We spoke about it, and we took pride that in the UN ranking, we are either number one, number two, always competing with Sweden. That was the calling sign of Jean Chrétien. Domestically, we might have our differences, but when we look at the world, we wear the Canadian flag, we speak to the world, we speak together. We should have an identity. That's what I was referring to in the case of France. The new France is the identity of de Gaulle. The very airport that the world flies into in trying to go to France is Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris. Everywhere there is the sign of it. So, as I said, two leading personalities that represents the French glory to a Frenchman is Napoleon and de Gaulle. And around that is all the literature, the history, and so on and so forth. The ruling elite in France, just as the ruling elite in Canada, the ruling elite in America, the ruling elite in Germany, they have trashed their own history. Now that is suicidal.
It is indeed. Listen, Salim, when we started this conversation, I tried to make a connection, if you will, between France and their election there and Canada and us. Call it the French connection, if you will. But this French connection and this conversation has basically made me feel better about the election in France, in that while we made pick nits over the domestic policies, economic policies of France, even in Canada, the minimum wage level, retirement age, immigration, things of this nature. Over all of it is this, again, fear of war. And we are approaching it. I mean, we fought 2 world wars in France. I have relatives who've fought in France, wounded in France, died in France in the First World War. And, we are a nation created partially by France. And so who cares about these little picayune issues when, if tomorrow the warmongers in NATO, gathering now in Washington to honor the fact that they've been around for 75 years, even though the Warsaw Pact hasn't been around for 33 years. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. That was the raison d'etre of NATO. This is ludicrous that we could even talk about the possibility of bombing Russian cities from NATO, using NATO weapons, sending in NATO soldiers into a country that's not even a part of NATO, that being Ukraine, who, and I digress a little bit, started this whole thing when they, the Maidan Revolution, 2014, they started to bomb the citizens, their own citizens in the Donbass, killing 3,000 of them plus, with Russia saying, this is stupid. We have a responsibility to protect our Tupi. And we started a special military operation. And now, because for some Russophobic reason, we could be going to war. But thankfully, it's sweet and sour, we now have a France, as you say, which is more of a de Gaulle nature, Charles de Gaulle nature, who's more of a person who would not go into Ukraine in this case. And so I think this is a positive thing. So why don't we leave it at that, Salim, unless you have a parting word?
No, I agree with you. I did not have any sense of dismay when the final results came out. I had a concern with the first round of voting that was projecting Marine Le Pen will come out. I mean, I have connection with France. I have friends in France. I have French people here in Canada who are French citizens and voted in the French election, and I was hearing them, I was talking to them, and they were all concerned with Marine Le Pen because those who were concerned with Marine Le Pen's France are concerned about what Marine Le Pen's legacy on which she rides, that is her father's legacy. Now, I don't want to say, and I don't believe in it, and I don't agree with it, that the sins of the father should be visited upon the sons and daughters. Each one of us as individuals have our own destiny to make, choices to make, and go forward. So that was not the position, but politics is a collective phenomena. And when the the man who would have become the prime minister if Marine Le Pen party went ahead and formed the government, if she had won the majority, because nobody would make coalition with her. So she had to win a majority seat. In a 577 seat parliament, she would have to win 289 seats to have that 50 plus one majority. Then the man who was designated to be the prime minister, Jordan Bardella, a young man, 28-year-old, he has been cited and quoted making, xenophobic, ethnocentric remarks about those people who are not French, and those are quoted words, that they are not French mean that they're Franco-African, Franco-Maghrebian, that if they do not find that they can live and abide by the French identity and French history, then they should leave France, and so on and so forth. So these were within underneath the radar, and the mainstream media was not presenting it. And then came the whole issue not only of Ukraine but also of Palestine, which we haven't talked about, and we'll leave it for another time. But you see, the new France, and so when I say Franco African and Franco Maghrebian, they're from Africa. And apart from Ukraine, Ukraine is a European affair, it is an EU affair, it is a NATO affair, and so on. But the Palestine issue, Israel issue, has become very much a global South issue, So Africa, with South Africa taking the lead position in making the application of genocide at the International Court of Justice, the hearing is going on. I mean, the case is open, and now the International Criminal Court coming out and asking for the arrest warrant to be issued for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Galan. Those are all issues on the table. And Mélenchon was speaking about those issues during the election campaign and before the election campaign, in contrast to the position of Macron and the position of Marine Le Pen. The New France rallied around Mélenchon, around New Popular Front. And the last point I would make, to wrap it up, as you suggest, is the French connection with us, Canada. And I'm looking around. I'm a new Canadian in that sense. I would call myself a new Canadian, not a hyphenated Canadian. I mean, we have talked about this, and you raised the issue that, you are from Newfoundland, and I was born in Calcutta, and both of us are speaking English. Both of us has a history of going to Jesuit school. And I mentioned to you, I'm an Anglophile. I love the language English. This is the language of Shakespeare, and I just love it. And the poetry, Shelley and Byron and Keats and the literature. And I'm an Anglophile. I dream and speak in English, I don't dream and speak in Urdu or in Bengali. These are my mother tongue or the languages of India. And I refuse to be a hyphenated Canadian. I came to Canada not to be an Indian, to be a Canadian, And I have spent my time studying Canadian history, studying Canadian politics, and so on and so forth. But I'm a new Canadian, I was not born in Canada. My son was born in Canada, my daughter, and they've been raised in Canada, So I'm a new Canadian. And just like there is a whole segment of Canadians who are new Canadians right across this vast five zone time zone country of ours. It is that is the French connection. That is the same thing in France. There's a new France, and they would rally around de Gaulle. And de Gaulle wouldn't say to them that, you can't speak or sing the Marseillaise as a Frenchman sing, because he is welcoming. He was the bridge builder between Africa and France, between France and Russia, and so on. He went to China to meet Mao long before Nixon went, and so on and so forth, because he stood and said he's not going to be dictated by the collective West, by the Anglo-American power. France has. So my question is, where are the Canadian voices? Where is it that in the question of war and peace, this new Canada is the Canada of the blue beret, of peacekeeping, of peacemaking? Possibly you have served in it because you were in the Canadian forces or you had gone as a cadet, But we know, both of us know so many people who have served in it. So where is the voice? This voice of peacemaking, peacekeeping, R2P is not anti-Russian or pro-American or anti-Canadian or anti-Israeli or anti-whatever. This is the voice that in this world we cannot afford this sort of actions, this sort of behavior, this sort of, where we are hurtling towards. And if by accident, the war is ignited, it will go. I mean, Putin has been warning that if you are going to escalate, this war can go nuclear. And that's what NATO has been doing. And they're pushing, So I wish there was a leader in Canada. Economic issue will always be there, because that's bread and butter issue. Inflation will always be there. But one major point here is, I would say, and wrap it up, is that either a country is going to be productive, economically speaking, and therefore, deal with all the problems of demand, supply, employment, etc., or it will be extractive. And in an extractive economy is what the collective West has become. It's not a productive economy. It is what Russia is today, what China is today, which is where the BRICS nations are. The supply chain has been moved out of here to the West. I mean, even if you talk about green energy, China is now the main manufacturing center of the green energy, whether it's the battery cars and so on and so forth, whether it is solar panel, it's China. So who made those decisions? Those decisions were made by political leaders over here, without the proper imagination, consultation, vision, and understanding of where the world was headed and where they were pushing the world. And now all of that is coming home to roost. So yeah, I mean, we can be sort of suicidal. That means we choose wrong decisions, and then the karma comes in, and we have to pay the price.
Always a pleasure, Salim. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.